We now turn our attention to the subject of galaxy evolution, which is at the core of most of the modern cosmology and extragalactic astronomy. First of all, galaxies must evolve for two reasons. They're made out of stellar populations and stars evolve, and also galaxies merge and assemble into ever larger objects through hierarchical structure formation. So therefore, there are two aspects to galaxy formation. One is the assembly of the mass, and the other one is conversion of gas into stars and energy. The former is relatively well understood. This is something we can model very well in numerical simulations, and it's driven by the dark matter. The latter is much more difficult because it involves messy dissipative processes, including star formation itself, the feedback of stellar populations, supernovae, active nuclei, and so on. And there we can model processes up to some limit using modern hydra simulations because the analytical theories of star formation do not exist. So even though dark matter dominates the process of galaxy assembly because it's the dominant mass component, that's not what we see. What we see is the light, and from that we have to infer about the assembly of the mass as well. First, let's take a look at the relevant timescales for galaxy evolution. One timescale will be typical starburst scale, which we now think is of the order of 10 to 100 million years. That also happens to be the time scale of the life of the very massive stars, which are energetically the dominant ones and which also provide most of the photons that ionize the interstellar medium. It also turns out that this is the estimated time scale of active galactic nucleus episodes, and it's not obvious whether this is a coincidence or not. The internal timescales within galaxies are commensurate with their freefall timescales, which would be a few 100 million years. And the timescales needed for merging and assembly are typically of the order of billion years. And finally, there is Hubble time of the order of 10 billion years, through which galaxies evolve. There are different observational approaches to this problem. First of all, we can look at our own Milky Way and try to deduce from its constituents and properties how it may have formed. Next, we can look at nearby galaxies and study the systematics of their properties, as we discussed earlier, through the Hubble sequence, through use of scaling relations, and so on. And finally, we can observe it directly by looking deep, since light travels at a finite speed. The further out we look, the deeper in the past we look. And so we can see galaxy evolution unfolding on our past light cone. To do this, we need a good combination of theoretical tools and observational tools. On theory side, we can use numerical simulations of structure formation to tell us about mass assembly. We can also predict behavior of the stellar populations because we know a lot about stellar evolution, and so making some assumptions about initial mass function of stars and the actual history of star formation rate in galaxies, we can predict what their spectra would look like as a composite of these evolving stellar populations. And there are also hybrid semi-analytical schemes that combine these. On the observational side, there are again three approaches. First, we can take deep images. The deeper the better if you want to look in the past, over a full range of wavelengths. And from those, we can infer a lot about star-forming histories of galaxies and maybe merging as well. More important approach is through spectroscopy, because this is what reveals not just redshifts of galaxies, but physical properties that happen in them, such as star formation rates, presence of an active nucleus, if there is one, etc., etc. And finally, we can look at diffuse backgrounds, the collective emission of all galaxies ever. Now that has a drawback of not knowing which source is where until you actually resolve the background. But it bypasses selection effects because you get everything, whether or not individual galaxies are detectable or not. A very important thing is to be aware of the selection effects, and they come in multiple guises. The most obvious one is the flux limit. Any given astronomical observation runs into the signal-to-noise problem at some faint level, and that's how deep you can go. But more subtly, there is a surface brightness selection limit that, for extended objects, it's the number of pixels above a certain threshold. That is, not just how much light there is, but how diffuse it's distributed. The more compact galaxies will be much easier to detect than diffuse ones. And so we know that for sure, the deeper we look, we're getting an ever more luminous or higher surface brightness objects and missing the intrinsically faint ones or the intrinsically diffuse ones. If we don't know what we are missing, then it'll be very hard to correct, but we can make reasonable extrapolations from nearer parts of the universe and see how that works. Let's refresh our memory of the dynamical evolution, galaxy merging. We've discussed this earlier and seen how hierarchical assembly of galaxies is a process that keeps going on from the earliest days of the universe, and we see it even today in major mergers of galaxies. This obviously arranges the mass, but thanks to the dissipation and inflow of gas to the centers, it can also trigger bursts of star formation, as well as feeding of active nuclei. Thus, stellar population evolution of galaxies and their dynamical evolution can be very deeply interconnected. An important physical process here is dynamical friction, and it works as follows. If you have a massive body, in this case, say a galaxy, moving through a sea of mass points, stars of another galaxy, say, it will accelerate them. And as it keeps moving, it will be encountering more and more stars to which it will exert its acceleration. Those stars acquire certain velocity, and that kinetic energy has to come at the expense of the perturber. So the stellar population or population of test particles in which this perturber plunges gains kinetic energy, usually in form of random motions, whereas the perturber loses its orbital kinetic energy. And this is why galaxies that are initially on parabolic orbits can merge. Incidentally, a good local example is the Magellanic Cloud, and they're being torn apart by tidal interaction with the Milky Way, and in a few billion years they'll merge with the Milky Way. This has already happened to numerous dwarf galaxies in the past, and we see fossil evidence of that in the Milky Way's halo. The timescale for dynamical friction can be expressed as follows. You start with the velocity, relative velocity of the perturber, divided by the rate in which that velocity is being diminished, deceleration due to the energy loss. After some theoretical computation, obtain formula like this. It has several interesting features. The denser the medium which is being perturbed, and the higher the mass of the perturber, the shorter timescale, which is intuitively clear. But also, the timescale gets to be longer if the velocity of perturber is high. And the reason for this is that perturbers that zip by very fast simply don't have enough time to deposit enough kinetic energy in the perturbee galaxy. So it will take many different passes for dynamical friction to actually do its thing. This is why the time goes up. We've seen numerical simulations of merging galaxies earlier, and this is a set of snapshots from one of those showing what dark matter particles do In these simulations, always, eventually, the merger product looks something like an elliptical galaxy. But if you follow the evolution of the gas, you find out that the gas is reacting much more to the encounter, and it's losing kinetic energy very quickly and very effectively, meaning it has to sink to the bottom of the potential well, which also means they will achieve high densities. This is exactly the kind of conditions that can lead to bursts of star formation, or they can also feed a giant black hole if there is one there. Next, we will talk about the models of the stellar population evolution.